and welcome back to the Bill Brief, the podcast where we break down legislation, what it says, why it matters, and how it could shape our communities. I'm your host, DJ William, and today we're going to be taking a closer look at H.R. 909, also known as the Crime Victims Fund Stabilization Act of 2025. Okay, so this bill is a little bit older, but it has passed House, and it was sponsored by Representative Ann Wagner. Okay, so the best way to understand this bill, and many others as well, is by putting ourselves in the shoes of someone who this bill would benefit. So imagine that you've been the victim of a crime, and you need help paying for counseling, medical services, or any other support. It kind of varies by crime, but we'll get into that. So there are government programs that are designed to help crime victims, but those programs need money to operate, as we all know. So that's where the Crime Victims Fund, also known as the CVF, comes in. So this bill that we're discussing today, H.R. 909, would give that fund another source of money. It would require certain civil penalties that are collected from cases involving fraud, as well as false claims against the federal government, to be deposited into the Crime Victims Fund all the way through fiscal year 2029. So right now it's 2026, so over 3 years, which is really cool. So instead of that money simply going into other federal accounts like they normally do, this bill would direct some of it towards programs that actually help people who've become victims of crime. So let's break it down and see how it works, but this is great. Honestly, when I read this, I was like, wow, because there are so many crimes that are being committed, right? And victims need support, and where better to get that support than people who are involved with cases that involve fraud, that involve false claims against the government, and the government is requesting them to give them money. Now that money that the government now has is going into the Criminal Victims Fund. Perfect. Amazing. Okay, so let's get into the major provisions of this legislation. Number one, the most important provision is that this bill adds another source of money to the Crime Victims Fund, as we discussed. So the main purpose of this legislation is to provide the Crime Victims Fund with additional sources of revenue. Right now, the fund receives money from various sources, including federal criminal fines, penalties, assessments, forfeited bail bonds, certain gifts and donations, and various other ones as well. But what this bill does is it adds civil monetary penalties from federal fraud and also false claim cases. So what are civil monetary penalties? I also had no idea, but let's view this in an example format. So let's say that someone lies to the federal government to get some money that they aren't supposed to receive. Now, the government is going to investigate this, and then they take that person or that organization to court. If this person or organization is found responsible, then the government could impose a civil monetary policy. What is that still? I love how I was like, yeah, I'm going to say that in an example, but I just used the exact word. No, it's kind of like a financial punishment. So this bill would say some of that penalty money should go toward helping crime victims. So civil monetary penalty is a financial punishment. Someone committed a crime, now they need to pay for it. But that penalty money under this bill would go toward helping victims of crimes. So really that money is going towards a good and a beautiful cause. So it's amazing. Okay, so what is the third main provision? It specifically targets federal fraud and false claims. So this bill isn't saying like, okay, every civil penalty that's conducted by the federal government would go into the Crime Victims Fund. It's not that vague, right? It specifically focuses on these two certain policies that are collected from cases involving fraud against the federal government and also false claims against the federal government. So the source of money matters under this bill. They're not just using every civil penalty. Okay, now the fourth provision of this bill, and the final one that we are going to talk about, is that the change would last all the way to fiscal year 2029. This isn't written as a permanent change, okay? Which is cool because most of the bills that we talk about are permanent changes. But here, it's only lasting until 2029, which is good. It is 3 years, honestly, a little more than 3 years if it's all the way until December. But that's good that it's not a permanent change, because this bill would direct those funds into the Crime Victims Fund all the way through that year, through fiscal year 2029, and Congress would eventually decide whether to continue the policy. So that's why when we start talking about the counter arguments, and we're going to get into it, but I'm going to be like, okay, guys, it's only going till fiscal year 2029. And the representatives that sponsored this bill, that wrote this bill, they know that, they're not sure how it's going to play out, how it's going to work. Do we need that much money going into the Criminal Victims Fund? So that's why they're doing it until fiscal year 2029 instead of making it, okay, this is going to happen forever. Because then they can see, okay, has it been benefiting over the past 3 years? Has there been a good change? And if there hasn't, then they're not going to continue the policy. So that's really good. And honestly, I think more bills should implement something like that. Okay, it's going to go to this fiscal year. When I used to do congressional debate, it would always be, the ending would always say remains null and void, which is super cool. But it also said this bill will begin or, start happening fiscal year 2026, fiscal year 2027. And some of them would say up until fiscal year this, right? So it's pretty cool when there's like a certain year, super interesting. But yeah, okay. And I remember some of our arguments would be like, okay, maybe that's too soon to start, especially if it had something to do with like drilling oil. We'd be like, okay, how can we do all of that, right? So that's where all the specifics come in. But this bill, the reason, it having specifics is actually a good thing. It benefits this legislation, and it makes me, more in favor of it. But let's get into it and see, is it really going to have a difference? Is it going to make an impact? Okay, so we've talked about the provisions. We've given ourselves a little bit of an overview / introduction. So let's see, what does the Crime Victims Fund actually do? This is really important because you might hear Crime Victims Fund and just think that victims are receiving checks from the federal government. That is not exactly how it works, but I could see how, you think that. I thought that as well. But this fund just supports programs, whether that's at the federal, whether that's at the state level, whether that's at local levels, right? So they basically support programs that help crime victims. What programs could this be? This could be like victim assistance. This could be counseling and support if they've been through a really traumatic experience and need to receive mental health support. It could include compensation programs and any other services that are for people who have been affected by crime. And, you can't really name all the specific services because there are so many different types of crimes, right? And there are victims go through so much. And these programs really support and would truly help them. So basically, the money would also help organizations and not just the victims. So you think, okay, it's helping the victims. It is helping the victims because they're receiving the support, but it would also help organizations and programs that are working directly with victims. Many organizations like these don't receive a lot of money, and they also don't receive a lot of patients because they can't afford their services, which is really sad. But also it would give them a clarification like, hey, we are making a difference in this victim's lives and we are being funded through the government. So that's super duper cool. Okay, so now let's talk about the positive implications and the positive effects of this legislation. The first thing that it does is it is more stable funding for victims. It has the biggest potential benefit, and that is additional money for programs that are serving crime victims. If the fund receives more revenue, then programs are going to have more resources to help people. So not only is it going to give the organization more money, but it's also going to help them provide more resources, right? Maybe, if they have mental health support, maybe they can create their own meditation room. Maybe they could do something specific for victims who face sexual harassment. There are so many things that they could do when they're receiving more money, as well as the victims who are being supported by the Crime Victims Fund. Okay. Also, something that I truly love about this bill, because you could say, hey, you know what, we are going to fund the Crime Victims Fund, but it's not about funding it. It's about where is that money coming from. Under this legislation, that money is connected to wrongdoing. It's connected to crimes. So many supporters of this legislation argue that there's just something fitting about taking money from penalties that are imposed because of fraud against the government and using it to help people who are harmed by crime. That is honestly a super duper cool thing. And if we look at it in simple terms, if someone breaks the rules and they pay a financial penalty, some of that money would help victims. So really think about it. When there is wrongdoing, we're using that wrongdoing to create a good. I did not say that in the best way, but yeah, I mean, there is good coming out of crimes, which obviously fraud is horrible. Tricking the federal government, also horrible. But seeing that those penalties that people have to pay, the money isn't just going nowhere and just being stored, right? It's going towards helping victims who deserve and who really need that support. Not as much want it, they need it. And that's what's really the distinguishing factor. It also helps state and local programs, as we talked about. It doesn't only support federal programs, right? Local ones that aren't well known, that don't have a lot of money. It gives them additional funding, and that additional funding could reach communities across the country. People across the country who are victims of crimes, who need the support. These organizations could help them. Truly, truly help them. Okay. The last positive implication that we're going to talk about before we go on to the counter arguments is that this bill helps make funding less dependent on criminal fines. The Crime Victims Fund, it has traditionally relied heavily on money that comes from federal criminal penalties and related sources, but adding another revenue stream like fraud could make the fund less dependent on one particular type of money, which is great, right? And that is the reason that this bill was written, and also the reason the bill has passed House, because they can see that not only is this bill going to be adding more money to the Crime Victims Fund, but it is taking that money from a really, really smart area, right? The way the money is coming into the Crime Victims Fund is super duper smart, very intellectual, and that is why this bill has passed House. Okay, so now let's get into the counter arguments and the overall concerns. And you know what I said at the beginning, right? I'm going to try to use the fiscal year 2029 argument for many of these, but let's see what happens. So, number one, the biggest critic is that money could be unpredictable. Now, fraud cases don't happen at the exact same rate every year, right? One year, the government could collect a huge amount from a major case, but another year, it could collect a lot less. So that means that this source of funding could be unpredictable. I agree that it could definitely be unpredictable. Maybe one year there are a huge number of fraud cases that are being committed, and maybe another year there's less. Maybe once this bill is passed, there are changes in the amount of crimes relating to fraud that are committed. But again, this isn't the only revenue stream that is being supported by the Crime Victim Fund, right? There are other money sources that are being used for the Crime Victim Fund. Not only this one, this is just an additional revenue stream, as we've talked about in the provisions of this legislation. So that's really cool. There are other support systems for the Crime Victims Fund, and I'm sure this isn't, okay, it's like only this one and done. I know that's what the bill says, that this is the main revenue stream, but I'm sure there will be other ways. And you're saying it's unpredictable. It's definitely unpredictable, but we cannot just say no to this legislation because of an if, And also, it may be unpredictable, but that doesn't mean it's going to be less, right? It could change throughout the years, but also the number of victims that need help could change. Maybe one year there is a lot of victims that need support. Maybe another year there's less victims. So if we keep basing it on like an if basis, right, then we're not going to get anywhere, because one year there could be victims that need a lot of support, right? We need to take a lot of money from the Crime Victim Fund, from the CVF. Another year there maybe not as much, so we would need less money, and maybe that's the year that there are less fraud cases, which would be in our benefit. So really, if we base it off of, okay, these ifs might happen or something might happen here, then we're just running an endless cycle, and that happens with every piece of legislation. Literally, honestly, every piece of legislation. So my response to this counter argument is like, okay, we could go back and forth. We could talk about not only the number of fraud cases, but we could even talk about the number of victims. And so since it's unpredictable, there is no need to talk about it and say, oh, okay, it's unpredictable, because people know that. But it's also like, it's great because unpredictability-ness, wait, that was not a word. It being unpredictable is really awesome, because it's not telling us, okay, here's the amount of money we're going to be getting into the CVF every year, right? Maybe that could be a bad thing. Maybe it couldn't. So there are lots of things that we can use to address here, but this doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing, is ultimately what I'm trying to say. I know I was rambling a little bit on that, but it ultimately doesn't mean it's a bad thing. Okay, so number two, and this one we've seen this over and over, right? It could affect other federal priorities. Now, if that money would otherwise go somewhere else, that's not directed to the Crime Victims Fund. People could argue that there are other federal programs that have fewer resources, and the question just becomes, where should this money go? Now, this bill is addressing the CVF. And the reason this bill was written is because right now CVF does not have a lot of money. And it needs a lot of money because we need to support victims. There are so many cases a year. Like it's honestly crazy where it's been increasing, right? And victims need the support. They need it, and they need this therapy. They need the mental health support, and there are various other support systems that they need, right? I'm just thinking of one particular type of case, but there are many. And I know that there are so many programs that have few resources, but this is the one that we're addressing today under this bill. And it's not like it's not important. It is really important. And because it is really important, we need to talk about it and we need to address it. And this is a great piece of legislation that does address the issue at hand. So for that reason, we should say yes because it is important, and it's not like, oh, okay. The CVF is doing great, and there's other that could benefit more. I think they could benefit equally because the CVF needs this money as well. Okay. The last counter argument that we are going to talk about before we close out for today is this the best way to fund victim services? Now, some critics argue that victim services should have a predictable source of funding instead of relying partly on penalties from fraud cases. And they may prefer Congress to establish a more stable funding mechanism. So we talked about the stability, right? Maybe it being unstable is a good thing. And we don't know yet if it's going to be super unstable, right? We can just say, okay, maybe it's going to be unstable, but we can't know that without taking action and passing this piece of legislation. Now, would it be good to pass this piece of legislation? Clearly, a majority thinks so because it passed House. And also, we keep seeing these counter arguments, but they're not addressing the issue at hand, which is that victims need support. And a lot of these critics, right, they say no to one piece, but then they don't have another solution. And clearly right now, this is a good solution. It is a great solution, actually. And it is taking money from something so bad, like fraud, and creating it into support for victims. And there's honestly, that is so beautiful. Okay, so we're going to close out with the overall of why this bill matters. And we can do this when we ask ourselves a question, right? When the federal government collects money from people or from organizations that commit fraud against the government, should some of that money be used to help victims? Supporters say yes. They could argue that victims need a reliable support and that penalties that are collected from wrongdoing are an appropriate source of funding. But critics respond that government penalties are unpredictable and that victim services need a more reliable, a more long-term funding system. But the bigger issue is about how the government chooses to use its money that it collects through enforcement. And that's what the bill addresses. All right. Okay, thank you so much for listening today, and we will see you next week for our next episode.